I had what I thought was a pretty good talk prepared, but there's only one problem. The notes are in my hotel room, I just discovered. So I'll have to wing it, and that means I can't take responsibility for quotes and exact references, but if you want them, I can provide them from memory, as is what I'll be talking about. There are, the world is, of course, always changing. There are, however, some quite significant continuities. It's worth paying attention to them. One is a principle that was expressed a couple of hundred years ago by a well-known figure named Adam Smith, who talked about governance and how it works. He pointed out that the people who own the society, those he called the masters of mankind, will also be the ones who set policy, and they will pursue what he called their vile maxim, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. If that sounds familiar, it is. He was, of course, particularly interested in England, and in England he said the masters of mankind are the merchants and manufacturers, and they devise policy. They're the principal architects of policy, and they ensure that their own interests are very well served, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England. But particularly what concerned him properly was the victims of their savage injustice elsewhere. India was his prime concern. There are modern, sophisticated versions of Smith's thesis adapted to our own society. The best one I know is by a very good, very fine political economist, Thomas Ferguson. It's what he calls his investment theory of politics. It interprets elections as occasions on which the groups of investors coalesce to invest to control the state. And as he shows over the past century, that's quite a good predictor of what policy is going to be, just looking at the coalitions of investors who became the principal architects of policy. Today it's not merchants and manufacturers, it's multinational corporations and financial institutions, but the principles remain about the same. In fact, we saw a good example of it in the last election, 2008. Obama's victory in 2008 was primarily due to a big flow of capital that poured in, especially toward the end, from financial institutions who preferred him to McCain, and that carried him over the edge. And of course, they expected to be rewarded, and they were immediately. The country was in the midst of a big financial crisis, so the main task was to deal with it. Obama picked an economic team to deal with the crisis. The team was selected almost entirely from the people who were responsible for the crisis. That excluded quite prestigious figures, Nobel laureates and others who had been very critical of what they'd done. And not particularly surprisingly, they produced a policy which rewarded those who were responsible for the crisis, often with criminal acts, and left everyone else in the dust. Actually, there was an interesting review of this a couple of days ago, which maybe you saw, by Neil Barofsky, who was the special investigator for the bailout. And he points out that the legislation behind the bailout was actually a compromise. The banks who were responsible for the crisis would be bailed out by the taxpayer, of course in violation of capitalist principles, but that doesn't bother anyone. But the victims, the people who were their victims, would get some kind of compensation. Well, he pointed out, now it's a couple of years later, we can see what happens. Half the compromise was carried out. The implementation responded to the people who have a voice. the masters of mankind, and they were billed out royally. They're now the biggest ones are richer and bigger than before, poised to set off the next crisis, which is almost inevitable. Meanwhile, the other half of the bargain was eliminated. Foreclosures continue to mount. They're going even higher. On those notes back in my hotel room, I have some of the numbers, but they're pretty telling. And that's the way democratic politics works in a society with high concentration of wealth and power. This concentration is not a law of nature. It's not due to economic principles or history or whatever. It's due to decisions, specific decisions. The country's always, of course, been unequal, but as I'm sure all of you know, it's now reached a level of inequality that's breaking all records. And that's misleading, because the actual primary cause of the inequality is in such a small sector of the population that it isn't even picked up by census figures. So you have to do more careful economic analysis to figure out what it is. It's basically the top 1/10 of 1% of the population, which has become spectacularly wealthy in recent years. The rest is bad enough, but that's what's tilting the balance kind of off the scale. And as in accord with Smith's maxim, they are, the greater their economic power, the greater their political power, and they use it to accelerate the vicious cycle that has been set off. It was set off in its current form back in the early 1970s. That's the major change in world affairs since the Second World War. There was an economic system, international economic system, established by the victors in the war, the United States and Britain, John Maynard Keynes for Britain, Harry Dexter White for the United States, so-called Bretton Woods system, which laid the basis for several decades of unparalleled growth over a long period. Economists sometimes call it the golden age of state capital. They call it capitalism, state capitalism, big state component in it. No financial crises. New Deal, the regulatory apparatus was still in place. The growth period was also egalitarian. The lowest quintile did about as well as the highest quintile. And that continued up until the 70s, the early 1970s. There was a significant shift. That compact, the Bretton Woods system, was based on regulation of finance, regulation of capital. So currencies were set pretty well fixed, a small band. Hence no speculation on currencies. Governments had the right to control capital flows, which they did. All of that was dismantled in the early 1970s and had a very big effect. One over the world. One in the United States, the effect was, and in fact elsewhere, a very sharp increase in in the growth of financial institutions. Back at that time, they were essentially doing what they're supposed to do in a state capitalist economy. Like a bank is supposed to take unused capital, like your bank account, and transmit it to some productive purpose. And pretty much that's what banks were doing. Now it's totally different. Starting in the early 70s, they moved towards more and more exotic financial manipulations, which have nothing to do with the productive economy, and in fact probably harm it, but do make plenty of money. That withdraws capital from productive purposes. But it reached such a point that right before the last crash, financial institutions literally had about 40% of corporate profits. By now, after the crash, now they're picking up again, and pretty soon it'll be the same or more. As I say, they have no known social function other than making money for people who play around with investments and short-term capital flows and so on. Meanwhile, and that set off this vicious cycle, increasing concentration of capital. The top 0.1% means CEOs, hedge fund managers, people like that. With it, concentration of political power. That concentration of political power is then used to escalate the cycle by all sorts of legislative means. For example, tax policy. Tax policy is increasingly designed to benefit the super rich and harm everyone else. That's been going on for years, has no economic purpose, but it does serve the interests of the masters of mankind. Sometimes it's done pretty subtly sometimes, so you don't notice it. So the Bush tax cuts, which are now heavily burdening the economy, were designed so that people wouldn't notice what's happening. So the first year, you may recall, the first year of the tax cuts, everybody got a small rebate, a couple $100 in the mail, so you feel good about it. And it wasn't too unbalanced the first year, somewhat, but not too much. But it was designed so that by the end, after the end of the 10-year period, over half went to the top 1% of the population. But by then, it's kind of hard to figure out, so people just remember that first year. It's called the sunset policy. You design policy so that first it won't be noticeable, but by the time the sun sets, it'll do the right thing, go into the pockets of the very rich. And those same policies continue to be pursued in other domains. Actually, we've just seen it in the lame duck session of Congress that, since last November. Obama was greatly praised for his statesmanship and bipartisanship and making important legislation go through, no bickering in Congress, and that's true. The main legislative achievement was to cut taxes for the super rich, and I mean super rich, like I'm pretty well off, but I was below the cutoff point. It's the very rich, make sure that they get a big tax cut. Meanwhile, everybody's pounding the table about the need to reduce the deficit. It was a pretty tricky PR campaign to carry that off, but it was done. At the same time, with less notice, there was a tax increase for federal workers. Now, it wasn't called a tax increase because that doesn't sound nice. It was called a freeze on pay. But it takes about 30 seconds for you to figure out that a freeze on pay for public sector workers is a tax increase for the public sector workers. And if it extends over a couple of years, it's a significant tax increase because of the effect of inflation, population growth, and so on. So a significant tax increase for public sector workers, big tax decrease for the super wealthy, huge impact on the deficit, trillions of dollars, and it was somehow carried off. Actually, there was another tricky measure that was introduced. There was a payroll decrease for Social Security. So, people who pay Social Security got a slight rebate. That's a good idea in itself. What's needed today is the deficit is a secondary problem. What's needed is a stimulus of demand to increase growth. You're not supposed to talk about that. That's outside the spectrum, but pretty obviously true. So a payroll decrease in Social Security makes good sense, but it's a Trojan horse. Take a look at the way it was designed. It was designed to run out just before the 2012 election. Both parties understand that with the 2012 election coming on, nobody's going to call for a tax increase. Okay, that's poison. So therefore it's permanent. Permanent decline in funding for Social Security means that it really will have a problem. Now it has no problem. That's all fakery. That's very good shape for decades to come and can be tweaked to go on forever. But if it is defunded, it'll have a problem. Now, there's a standard way of privatizing something. Like when Margaret Thatcher wanted to privatize the British railroads, the technique was defund them. And then when they don't work, people get angry. They say, let's do something. So you hand it over to private enterprise, which totally ruins them, and then the state has to come back in, big cost, and try to reconstruct it somehow. It's known as privatization. That's exactly what's happening with Social Security. It's in good shape now when you read in the newspapers, as you do, that the big problem of the deficit is entitlements. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Social Security is a zero problem. For one thing, it doesn't add anything to the deficit because people pay for it. And for another thing, it's in pretty good shape. Certainly, the last of the famous baby boomers will be gone before there's any problem in it. That's why there's a big payroll tax increase 30 years ago to ensure that. But if it's defunded, it'll be a problem. Then there'll be pressure to privatize it. That's a huge bonanza for the financial institutions. It'll put trillions of dollars into their hands, which they can then use to make a ton of money with risky investments, which are therefore very profitable. And when it tanks, as it will, when the economy tanks, there's a technique. You pick up your copies of Milton Friedman and Hayek and Ayn Rand, and you run to the nanny state that you've nurtured, and you make sure that they bail you out. That's really existing capitalism. And it means that the scam can go on. The name for it is too big to fail. And as one commentator put it, also too big to jail, because a lot of this is purely criminal. Borofsky points out that credit agencies are now taking into account and assigning rankings on the assumption that the system's going to crash and that the taxpayer will come in and bail them out. That's what we call capitalism. Market principles for the poor, but not for me, please. That's traditional. I'll come back to it in a minute. But that's what's being done with Social Security. It's also being done with public education. It's being defunded, so it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, people get angry. And then they want to do something about it, and then the propaganda starts pouring in about teachers with their huge pensions and so on and so forth. And so people get angry at teachers, not at Goldman Sachs, which just announced quietly $17.5 billion of compensation for the executives who created the crisis, special $12.5 million bonus for the CEO, and tripling of his base salary. You don't get angry at them. What you do is get angry at the teachers, the firefighters, and all these people are milking us and so on. A standard technique of population control. And if you defund the system and people want to privatize it, it'll sooner or later get privatized because it doesn't work very well. It'll be worse, but it's fine for the rich. They'll be taken care of. They don't care much if you have public education. Actually, you might ask, why is there such an intense effort, and it's really fanatic if you look at it, to destroy Social Security and public education? They work pretty well. Social Security has like a tiny fraction of the administrative costs of privatized systems. In fact, basically none. All the money comes right back to the people who paid the taxes. And it's of no value to rich people, like Pete Peterson, the multi-billionaire who's pressing the campaign. He points out constantly, look, I don't care about it, which is quite true. He wouldn't notice it. It's not even a rounding error. But a lot of people live on it, especially after they've lost all their assets. There's just been a loss of $8 trillion of capital that people mistakenly put into housing. The economists and the Federal Reserve were, for ideological reasons, I'll come back to it, didn't notice that there's a huge housing bubble had nothing to do with any economic fundamentals. It was completely dissociated from from rents, which it should be connected to. And it was totally off the chart of 100 years of records of how housing pretty much correlated with economic growth. Here it shot up. It wasn't noticed because of a religious doctrine. It's a religious doctrine called the efficient market hypothesis. That's what Joseph Stiglitz, 15 years ago, Nobel laureate, called the religion that markets know best. And if you're a firm believer in the religion, it'll take care of itself. So you don't have to notice it. And when it crashes, you say, I'm sorry, folks, but now it's up to the taxpayer to bail you out, government insurance policy, and the game goes on. It gets worse next time. In the one of the parts of the vicious cycle that's underway is the change in other legislation. So starting from the 70s, primarily the Reagan years and on, it goes right through Clinton, and of course with Bush, the regulatory apparatus was dismantled. And the barrier, New Deal barrier between commercial and investment banks was broken. That's when the financial crises began. There weren't any in the 50s and the 60s when the New Deal system was in place. But they started under Reagan. Reagan left office with the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, savings and loan. The country was a little less in the grip of this fanaticism then, so there were many convictions, felony convictions for those criminal acts, I think about 1,000. And that, of course, brought up lots of information, but not this time. This time, the guys who carry out the crimes do it with impunity. They're too big to fail, and they're too big to jail, so you don't investigate them. Again, this is all policy. There were other policy decisions that aren't too visible, like changing the rules on corporate governance, which essentially permit CEOs to pick the boards that set their salaries, or to give them stock options or something else that isn't noticeable. Well, all of these things mount up. They're designed to extend the vicious cycle. It's exactly what they do. And we now have a situation. There's something else that's happening too. Several things. I might as well add those. Meanwhile, in relation to this, to the financialization of the economy, there's the rate of profit in manufacturing was in fact declining. So you can make more money by financial manipulations than by producing. And it became increasingly easy to set to offshore production. That's what's called neoliberalism. What it is it's sometimes called free trade. It has nothing whatsoever to do with free trade. It's a system which is highly protectionist for the powerful. So huge grants for, you look at the World Trade Organization rules, guarantees for monopoly pricing rights for publicly funded institutions like the pharmaceutical institutions, protection for professionals, no competition for them. But you set working people in competition with one another all over the world. There's obvious effects. It means that worldwide, in fact, there's a decrease in the share of income by working people. It's strikingly true in the United States. During the period of this vast increase in wealth for a tiny sector, wages, real incomes for the majority of the population have stagnated. People get by with higher working hours, in fact, by now higher than Europe and even Japan, debt, which can't go on forever, and asset inflation. That is the hope that your investment in things like your home will carry you over, except that that's all paper money. It's rammed down people's throats with cheating, delusions. It's like nothing new about this. This is the 1920s all over again. I mean, my father, for example, a poor immigrant, was deluded into buying property in Florida. There was a big real estate boom. It ended up being somewhere at the Atlantic Ocean. That's not much different from the subprime mortgage scams that are going on today. But those who are responsible do it with impunity under the real laws of capitalism. We're being set up for the next and even worse crisis. The major banks, investment firms are richer than before. They're sitting on tons of cash. Corporate profits are sky high. There's a problem in the economy of limited demand. There isn't enough. People are too poor to purchase. There's no consumer demand. Not much investment. There's an answer to that. The government can increase demand, stimulate it. That's how we got out of the Great Depression. That's how other countries get out of depressions. We've done it too. But that's not what the masters of mankind want. They want a focus on the deficit and the debt. One of the disadvantages of not having notes as I got off track, I was going to ask the question, why, so I'm going to go back to that. Why, if this is disjointed, blame it on my notes up there. It was better organized than the original. But why the desperate effort to destroy Social Security and public education? It can't be because they're not working. They both work extremely well. We had a great public education system here, from the schools up to higher education, all being dismantled. So I don't know what the story is here, but in a majority of the states in the country, tuition now pays more of the cost of universities, state universities, than the state does. In California, which is, had the greatest public education system in the world, next year, for the first time, tuition is going to be more than half the funding. Tuition is going sky high. It's like private universities, and probably the main California universities, Berkeley and UCLA, probably they'll be privatized. They're almost privatized already with the scale of tuition and so on, and the rest of the system will decline. For the rich, it's fine. It doesn't affect them. Kids are going to go to private universities anyway. For the state's economy, it's going to be a serious danger. The economy relies on and has grown thanks to an educated population. That brings up another fact. I'll put it off to the side for a moment and hope to remember to come back to it, so remind me if I don't. There's, in the current stage of capitalism, the long term doesn't matter. That's a change from the past. What matters is what happens tomorrow to your what shows up in the next quarter, which also determines your salary and so on, if you're a CEO or if you're a fund manager or whatever. So the future doesn't matter, the state of the country doesn't matter, and that's what we see happening. Well, why the attack on public education from kindergarten on up? Why the attack on Social Security? It can't be because of their inefficiency. In fact, they work very well. It has to be something else. And I think if you think about it, you can see what it is. Social Security and public education are based on an extremely dangerous principle, namely that you care about other people. So, for example, I don't happen to have kids in school anymore, but if you believe in public education, I'm supposed to pay my taxes so that the kid across the street can go to school. That's called solidarity, mutual support, sympathy, and so on. Same with Social Security. Like, it really doesn't matter much to me. I get it, but it doesn't matter much. Got a big pension. But I'm supposed to... the principle of Social Security is that I care if a disabled widow across town doesn't have enough food to eat. If you believe in the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else, then it's her problem. Her husband made a bad investment or something other. Her problem, she can starve. No reason why I should give a few pennies to, which I won't notice, to make sure that she's okay. So there's a principle of care and concern for others. It's completely inconsistent with the vile maxim, and therefore it has to be destroyed. And any institution that relies on it has to be destroyed. We see that happening all over the place. It's a major cultural phenomenon of trying to destroy the the most elementary human feelings. And they are elementary. To see how elementary they are, it's worthwhile going back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, say mid-19th century. Eastern Massachusetts, where the Industrial Revolution took off, there was a very free press, the freest in the history of the country. There was hundreds of newspapers written by communities, ethnic communities, workers in factories, others, expressing their views about the world and their interpretation of the world. A lot of dedication to it. A lot of the papers were in the factories. The press was run by, say, Irish artisans from Boston or young women from the farms who were called factory girls. And they make very interesting reading. They express the way people felt about the early stages of industrialization. What they felt was that their culture and their humanity was being destroyed by the process of industrialization, which was forcing them into a mold in which they're basically slaves. So workers in the mid-19th century didn't see much difference between a chattel slavery and wage labor. In fact, the only difference they saw was that one of them's temporary, so you can get out of it. That was the slogan under which Northern workers went to war in the Civil War. In fact, it was such a popular idea that it was one of the main slogans of the Republican Party. Wage labor is basically the same as slavery. They also bitterly opposed what they called, this is 1850, what they called the new spirit of the age. It gained wealth, forgetting all but self. Okay, that was the new spirit of the age in 1850, being rammed down their throats, still being rammed down people's throats, major efforts, because it's so totally inhuman that it's hard for people to accept it, but with enough beating it into your heads, maybe it'll take off. That's the hope, at least. That was the new spirit of the age then. It was the vile maxim that Adam Smith wrote about, and it's the doctrine that's being implemented right now. Right now it's called serious and courageous. When Congress gets a proposal to cut back food stamps on which 20% of the population relies, and to cut social services for the general population, but also to cut taxes for the very rich. That's serious and courageous, we're told in the newspapers. It's a basic assault on the fundamental principles of any civilized society, and it's the agenda that's being considered and in part implemented by both parties, incidentally, to varying degrees. What about the famous deficit? Suppose that we suspend disbelief and say it's really a problem. I mean, of course, it's a problem in the long term, but a very serious question whether it's an immediate problem. But let's say it is. How do you get rid of it? Well, there's some pretty straightforward ways. Just take a look at what causes the deficit. That sounds simple. About half the deficit comes from military spending. U.S. military spending is off the chart. It's about the same as the rest of the world combined. That's not for security. In fact, it harms our security, but it's for other reasons. But that's one place where you can cut away at the deficit. The other where's the other half come from? It comes from our dysfunctional healthcare system. It's the worst healthcare system in the world. It's an international scandal. It's about twice the per capita costs of comparable countries. Generally poor outcomes by standards of rich countries, even poorer ones. And there's a reason for it. It's the only system that's privatized and basically unregulated. It's so crazy that the United States is, I think, the only country in the world where the government is barred by law from negotiating drug prices. So like the Pentagon can negotiate prices for paper clips, but the government can't negotiate drug prices, with a single exception, the Veterans Administration. And their drug prices are a fraction of what most people pay, and a fraction, and the same is true in other countries. So, in fact, if you take a look at the costs of the massively inefficient privatized healthcare system, what you discover is that, I'll give you the sources if you like, that if we had the same kind of system as other industrial countries, not exactly a utopian ideal, we would have no deficit. In fact, we'd have a surplus. But you can't touch that because that goes after the insurance companies and the financial institutions. That's untouchable. They're the masters of mankind. So that's not discussed, which means that the talk of the deficit is a total farce from beginning to end, even if you accept that it's significant. But it makes sense in terms of Adam Smith's principles. There's all of this correlates with a lot of other phenomena that are worth thinking about. So, for example, there have been a lot of studies of the relation between Senate votes and popular opinion. It turns out that there's a correlation for the richest. For the richest part of the population, there's pretty good correlation between Senate votes and preferences. For the middle of the population, there's no correlation. For the bottom third of the population, there's a negative correlation. That is, Senate votes are the opposite of what people want. There's many studies of the relation between public policy and public preferences. There's a very sharp disconnect, both domestic and international policy. Well, that's in accord with Smith's truism. You might ask whether that's consistent with the thinking of the Founding Fathers. That's actually an interesting question. In fact, it turns out that it is. So if you read, say, the records of the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, the main framer, explains to the convention that the country has to be set up so that power will be in the hands of what he called the wealth of the nation, the more responsible set of men, those who have respect for property owners and their rights, and who understand that a major goal of policy must be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And for that reason, the system was set up the way it is. Power was primarily in the hands of the Senate. The Senate, of course, was not elected. It wasn't elected till long after. And as Madison put it, the Senate will be the wealth of the nation, and they'll carry out policies in the interests of the nation. The House, which is much responsive to the population, had very little power. The executive in those days was an executive, an administrator, not an emperor. That's changed over the years. So that was the basic structure of the country. But in Madison's defense, you have to recognize that he was pre-capitalist. He did not understand the capitalist system. For him, the senators, the wealth of the nation, were like the mythical Romans of the fantasies of the time. They were benevolent aristocrats and gentlemen who would have the interests of the country at heart. Adam Smith had a somewhat sharper eye. And Madison pretty soon saw it too. By 1792, he was already deploring the effects of the democratic experiment. And he said its power is being taken by the stock jobbers, the stock market of his day, who were the tools and tyrants of government, overwhelming it with their power, benefiting from its largesse. A pretty good description of today. But by then the system was in place. There have been battles about this over the centuries, but fundamentally it remains pretty much like this. It's also worth remembering, I don't want to go on too long, that the idea that the head of a corporation, let's say, doesn't care about the future, that's new. You go back 20 or 30 years, the CEO of, say, Ford or General Motors or General Electric did care about the future of the firm. They were trying to establish firm loyalty. They were building for the future. And That's before the big shift of the early 70s. And now that's not true. With the financialization of the economy, the offshoring of production, they don't need a workforce. They can use cheap labor in the Chinese assembly plant or in Vietnam or someplace even cheaper. And if American workers collapse, well, it's their problem. Since we believe in the vile maxim, who cares? They should have become CEOs like me. If they didn't, too bad. They can get food stamps as long as they're around, but they're not going to be around for long. That changed with the financialization of the economy and the offshoring of production and the setting of working people in competition with each other throughout